Hello, and welcome back to our Hopkins at Home mini course on the history of fake news from the flood to the apocalypse. This week we're turning our attention away from classical antiquity to the world of the early Christian era and the subsequent production of apocryphal, pseudepigraphal texts. And so we'll learn all about, in the next 45 minutes, the history of sorting out sacred history, and in the process, the invention of some pretty amazing things that a lot of people know about, but that are fascinating for our purposes. At various times in the history of even late antiquity, producing fake news about religious revelations, in addition to sorting out the canonical, what are called the deuterocanonical, and then the apocryphal texts of the biblical tradition in the Judeo-Christian world. Now, briefly to begin, it helps to think about forgery as the ultimate enterprise in minding the gaps. To quote that otherworldly voice that one hears in the tube in London, if you're lucky to travel there. That is to say, filling in the blanks of the Bible story. And we must mind the gaps. We must, to use the Latin phrase, caveat lector, buyer beware, because there we not only find what seems to survive of the ancient world, but also what people in later periods of history wished had been written in the first place, but had not. Now, the ultimate effort to fill in the gaps, really, in air quotation marks, to fill in the gaps, might be Noah's Ark replicas of the 20th and 21st centuries. We're going to be talking about the Nuremberg Chronicle in a bit, from which you see a late 15th century Noah's Ark replica, but you can also go to Williamstown, Kentucky, to visit the Ark Encounter. And there you can literally see a life-size, air quotes, version of Noah's Ark. We actually only know of Noah's Ark through the text of the Bible and the scriptures in Genesis. But here you go. History comes alive. You can wander around just as Noah and his wife and his family and experience the ark. You can even imagine history coming alive and watching carpentry being done in this incredible place. In people's spare time, reading the odd scroll, as it were, or playing primitive instruments. You have families walking by observing the ritual faith observances of Noah and his family. Strangely enough, electrification seems to have existed in Noah's Ark as well. And last but not least, you can encounter dinosaurs. That's right, dinosaurs, because this is a literal interpretation of scriptural history. And in this particular conception of sacred history, dinosaurs must be explained. And if the Bible says that 2 of every creature in the world went into Noah's Ark, that had to include dinosaurs. This little boy looks a little skeptical of that. This is one way to fill in the gaps, as it were, of sacred history, and leading to rather surprising results. You can watch all about this in Russell Crowe's remarkable film, Noah, and you can even encounter Anthony Hopkins playing perhaps a only somewhat convincing Methuselah, who died at the age of 969. I'm not sure how a makeup artist can do better than this. We could move after the flood waters recede to the time of Moses and the Ten Commandments. It's often been asked to me, what is the one thing we want most for the libraries at Johns Hopkins by way of rare books and manuscripts? My go-to is always the original autographed manuscript of the Ten Commandments. However, we know that in the early 1980s, Indiana Jones rediscovered the Ten Commandments in the Raiders of the Lost Ark. He had to fight off evil Nazi archaeologists who were vying for possession of this most sacred artifact. And we, of course, know as a result of this that it ended up in a in a box and has been stored in one of the government's gigantic warehouses somewhere in the United States, presumably. You can reenact the experience with action figures that even have moving tops for this Ark of the Covenant. The description for which is literally exclusively from the book of the Bible. But there is this importance about all of this, that there is a literalism that has existed in the history of the world and was never perhaps more pronounced than in the Renaissance and in the period in which maps like this in the early Enlightenment are being produced, because there is a faith tradition of the belief in the scriptures that it can be literal, as well as a literary tradition that still interprets them visually, imaginatively. And this gives rise not only to scholarship about biblical texts and the sacred history, but also forgeries. Now, the text of the Ten Commandments was a text. Thus, it is a real thing, at some point, a text written down and remembered over time. It exists at least from the reality of the Old Testament scriptures. And there are traditions of thought about how that moved around and what the Ark of the Covenant looked like and how this thing fit into people's lives. Now, the oldest running library and rare book library in the world that's still around is the Vatican Library. And here is the beautiful Salone Sistino, which is this incredible entry point into this space. And in it is a visualization of the textual history of all time. I don't have time to walk you through it except to show you the image of Moses as, amongst other things, the inventor of the Hebrew language. And his story, and indeed the story of sacred history, the story of the Judeo-Christian tradition, is ultimately about books. It is a book history. Hence, a rare books curator talking to you about this. And even the Ten Commandments sits atop these codices, which were inventions of the Middle Ages and onwards, and proliferated in the era of print as never before. What is all of this? How do we make sense of history except to create a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end? If there is a Hebrew language, it must have had an inventor. That inventor, for the purposes of the Vatican Library, was Moses. Let's walk through sacred history and get a better sense of this. How all of this history, pagan and Christian, ancient, medieval, and early modern, all were made to fit together in a single narrative. And from there, get to a better understanding of the nature of canonical and apocryphal texts about that, including lots of stuff in our Bibliotheca Fictiva at Johns Hopkins. Here is the initial pages of this incredible book, an incunabulum, a book printed before the year 1501 and about the first 50 years of printing, by Hartmann Schädel in the German city of Nuremberg. It is a history of the world from the 6 days creation in the book of Genesis, once again, all the way to the apocalypse. And somewhere in there is the flood and everything else, and then the end of the world, not unlike our course. So here's God in heaven telling us a history that begins as a Bible history. The story of the world begins in the beginning, in principio, in the beginning, the initial words of the text of the Bible. And as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, the initial words of this history of the world. It is all of human history, from the flood to the apocalypse, in one book. This is, in a sense, what the Bible is. And this, a version of that, mixed up with everything that came between the last of the biblical texts produced in the period of the New Testament, up to about the time of the apostles, 100 years or so after Jesus, onwards to 1493 when the book was published, to the end of the world. This is how, in 1493, somebody imagines the separation of the heavens and the earth, the light and the darkness, the stars and the planets, the creation of the seas, the birds and the fishes, of Adam, coming out of the clay. A perfectly ordered universe with the earth at the very center and then emanating outwards to the empyrean heaven of God, the angels, saints. Eve coming from Adam's rib, the original sin of eating the forbidden fruit, of being expelled from the Garden of Eden, and then the wages of sin. The original sin of Adam's curse to work the soil, and Eve's curse to suffer the pains of childbirth. She also did a lot of the tilling and working of the earth, too. We're going to get a bit more into this when we read the secret history of Adam and Eve. We'll learn about that in just a bit. So here is then how it starts beyond those initial stages. It's a gigantic family tree. In the pre-modern, the early modern worlds, there is this sense of genealogical descent. Indeed, as we see in forgeries, also an interest in the genealogical descent, not only of figures of authority, but also of texts of genealogies. They have lifetimes, and they all come together in the physical text of the Nuremberg Chronicle. So here is Adam and his progeny. Here is that Noah's Ark recreated in 1493. Noah is sporting some pretty dramatically updated 1493 Nuremberg burger clothes, but nonetheless. Then we have the story of what happens after the flood. The world has to be repopulated, and here are the repopulators. Shem, who settles the continent of Asia, Ham of Africa, and Japheth of Europe. 1493, it's still too close to Columbus's first voyage for us to get the inclusion of America, the Americas. We'll have to wait for that. That comes later. We have, at the same time as the world is being repopulated by the humans, it is also being repopulated by humanoids, those monstrous races that we talked about, described in such great detail by Ctesias, by Herodotus, by St. Augustine and St. Isidore, and all of these other figures of the ancient pagan and early Christian worlds. The Blemii, the men with their and women with their heads in their bodies, which pervades medieval and Renaissance art. And then Noah, the patriarch, and his progeny, begetting. All that begetting in the Bible happens pretty much, for the most part, after the flood. And a lot of it has to be had in order to repopulate the whole wide earth. What is the history of the world after the flood? Well, first of all, it is the building of cities. Here is the Tower of Babel. We talked about this last week. Here it is again, writ large in the sequence of images that comprise the history of the world in the Nuremberg Chronicle. If you look at this long enough, you probably figure out what it is. This is the fall of the city of Sodom. And at the heart is Lot's wife, who is turned into a pillar of salt for having looked back at this. And Lot and his daughters being led by the angels in safety. We have the advent of built cities, not just towers of Babel, but the actual city of Babylon itself, and an image of a god on a pillar to symbolize the paganism of the Babylonians. But if you follow on the left hand, you'll also see contiguous to the same part of the history is the presence of the historical figures of Minerva, Prometheus, of Apollo and Jupiter. They are, as Euhemerus had done in the ancient world, placed the gods back into human history, even into places at specific times. This is very important for the forger. You need these people to be somewhere so that you can follow their descent and rationalize them and justify the way that you do that by re-rationalizing and re-mythologizing history as a latter-day forger. So you have the Amazons, these stately women in their plate armor, right alongside the Egyptians being flooded in the Red Sea, literally a Red Sea, as Moses crosses the river. You have the Ten Commandments. This is well before Indiana Jones, so it had not yet been discovered, as it were, the Ten Commandments, and placed into a warehouse in some place in the United States of America. It was imagined, based upon the scriptures, that this is what it all would have looked like. You also have the invention of alphabets. So Cadmus, this Greek king, invents the Ionian letters of the Greek alphabet. So just as the cities are invented, so are the languages, so are technologies. Music is invented by Tubal and so forth and so on. And you have the foundation of more and more cities. Now, the Nuremberg Chronicle has over 900 separate woodcuts. It's the most incredible illustrated book. It's gigantic as well. We have 3 copies of this at Hopkins. But it's very expensive to make woodcuts, so they repurpose the same cityscape for multiple cities. So Padua looks like this, with its as does the city of Messina. And here you see these mosque-like looking structures, this tower. Follow that tower into the city of Nicaea itself, where one of the early Christian councils meet, and also into the city of Mons. So now we've gotten to King David. We're making some progress. And here the queen of here's Sheba and Solomon as part of the family tree, and then the Temple of Solomon, which is where the Ten Commandments end up. In a sense, the Temple of Solomon, thus, is a library, a repository of a text. The history of the world by this time then begins to kind of be delineated in a bifurcated way. In a sacred history on the left, which is the history, in this case, of high priests of Israel, subsequent to that, of pontiffs or popes in the Roman Catholic dispensation. This book was printed before the Protestant Reformation. And on the right, you have the kings of Israel. So you have the sacred history on one side and the secular history on other. In some histories, this begins at the fall of Troy as opposed to the building of the Temple of Solomon, where the Aeneas flees Troy, and then he creates lines of kings, and then there are priests and popes. In any event, this is how people rationalize putting all of history together in one place. You have the great ancient city of Rome with all of its identifiable landmarks. The Vatican is on your right, the old St. Peter's. And on the left, you'll see the Pantheon, and to the far left, the Colosseum. These are recognizable and well-known and easily documented. What is perhaps less so is to imagine the rough contemporaneity of Pythagoras the philosopher, of Sappho, the impossibly ancient poetess, and then right alongside them, Ezekiel and Daniel, the Hebrew prophets. There is a simultaneity here which also creates an opportunity for creative activity, of recreative activity in the great timeline of history. You have Hippocrates and Zeno, Socrates, Isocrates. As much as you have the rise of cities, you have the fall of cities. Here comes Babylon's fall at the hands of the Persians, the rise of Alexander the Great. Zoom ahead to, no pun intended, plenty of us are doing too much of the zooming. Here is Julius Caesar, who sees the 3 sons to the left shortly before his assassination. And the worst moment in the history of the world, in my humble opinion, the burning of the Library of Alexandria, the most horrific scene imaginable to a rare books curator, the burning of books. Julius Caesar is roughly contemporary to the time of Mary, and thus very close to that moment of the assassination of Julius Caesar, we have the birth of the Blessed Virgin Mary according to her Immaculate Conception, and stages in her own life and the life of Jesus. So we've gone through everything from the creation of the world and the flood, the advent of the Jewish people, the building of the Temple of Solomon, the passage of ancient Greek and Roman gods in the world, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Bibliotheca Alexandriana, all of that. And we have the birth and the life of Jesus and the apostles. And then the execution of the apostles, in addition to the crucifixion of Christ. Here, Peter, the apostle, hung upside down on a cross, crucified, and Paul, who's, actually we don't know his fate, but the reconstruction of his life is that he was beheaded in the city of Rome, of which he was a citizen. And then Simon the apostle, here beaten and taken to the sword, as well as on the right, the Apostle John burned in oil, miraculously surviving, according to some accounts. And women. Lots of the earliest Christians were not just men, they were also women saints and martyrs, as we see here with Petronella holding her martyr's palm. Well, we are now getting to the end of the world, because here is John the Apostle and the evangelist, who is the author of the book of Revelation, here being given that divine revelation in the text, which will become very quickly applicable in this work, as we will see. Indeed, here we have the shift from the biblical period to the history of the early Christian church, which is ultimately a Christian history, and a litany of martyrs, of witnesses and apostles, evangelists to the new Christian revelation of the period of Jesus in the New Testament onwards. So the sacred history is pretty much clear and illustrated and deontological. It moves from one direction to the other, and always directed by divine force. Here we have images of the 7 sleeping martyrs. These are people who fell asleep during the Roman persecution and woke up 200 years later when it was all over. The ultimate Rip Van Winkle crowd. They're plugged into this story, even though the tale is apocryphal. The earliest church councils, the Council of Nicaea that creates the Nicene Creed, the advent in late antiquity of the early Christian saint scholars, the doctors of the church, St. Ambrose, St. Jerome, the great translator of the biblical text, who we'll talk about more, and St. Augustus, the great author of the Civitate Dei, the City of God, one of the earliest and most influential theologians of all time. Well, now we're getting into the Middle Ages, and here we have Charlemagne. I said in a nutshell, we're doing pretty well on time too. Charlemagne, so crowned as Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in the year 800. Now, remember, this is a text written by monks for the most part, and by scholars educated by a lot of them for the priesthood. A lot of the texts that form the Nuremberg Chronicle beyond the Bible are chronicles written in the Middle Ages by monks. And it's not surprising then that in the shift from the ancient and the late antique worlds to the Middle Ages, we're going to move towards the foundation of monasteries, places that books are kept, that the texts of history are kept, and thus the founding of the Cistercian order and the Carmelite order, a kind of generalized and, as you can see, repeated stock image for shorthand stock image for monastery. The advent of the Mendicant orders with St. Francis of Assisi and St. Dominic, who create the Friars Minor, the Franciscans, and the order of preachers, the Dominicans. We also have women in this story, foundresses of sacred orders of nuns, also incredibly interesting and influential figures like Catherine of Siena, who was associated with the Dominicans and was incredible in her own right. She was a diplomat who represented the Pope on missions. She wrote letters. She corresponded with princes and kings. She wrote mystical texts and so forth and so on. They're not left out of history, women, in this book, but they certainly are not everywhere. This is an early modern or pre-modern book. As you go through, you see lots of signs of things to come as well. And prophecy is a very useful tool for forgers because they can play around with chronology and invent prophecies, as we'll see. So lots of comets, funny juxtapositions, eclipses, lots of heavy torrential rainstorms, ice storms, fire falling from heaven, all signs of things to come. And then, of course, prodigies, lions with humanoid heads, Siamese twins, people who were half jackal, half human, and so forth. These prodigies are supposedly prophetic signs of bad things to come, as indeed did in this rather prophetic image of a pestilence of locusts that is placed beside the note of the lugubrious and misery-filled pest of the year 1348, which refers to the bubonic plague striking Europe, which lasted and began, as it says here in Latin, for 3 years. an image of some significance to us in our global pandemic today. The story goes on to crusades, not only of conquering the Holy Land and extirpating the Islamic occupiers of the Holy Land as they were considered by the Christian Europeans, but also pogroms against Jews, as is shown here, with the immolation of a Jewish population. Again, the same stock image here, again, in the year 1492, when during the Reconquista in Spain, Jews were forced either to convert or to leave Spain. And then the worst of all possible events, the fall of Constantinople, the center of the ancient, the last remnant of the ancient Roman Empire in 1453 to Turkish invaders. And then very quickly we get to the end of the world, or at least to the year 1493. If you read this paragraph, and I've given you a blow above it in Latin above, it is hilarious. It basically tells us, it was thought useful to add a few blank leaves to those already devoted to the sixth age of the world. There are 7 ages. The sixth is just before the end. We are all in the sixth of 7 ages. These pages were left at the end for the end of the sixth age of the world, on which emendations and additions may be made of the deeds of princes and other events which may yet take place. Various marvelous events occur day by day, requiring new books in which they might be related. That which is marvelous, that which is wondrous, that which is extraordinary and prodigious ought to be written down. And indeed, 6 blank pages in this huge 1,000-page book are given for us to write the rest of the history of the world until the end of the world. 1493 was 7 years away from a very round number of the year 1500. And so the book reflects the kind of imperative notion of the end of the world being just around the corner. And here we have the great conflict between the forces of evil and the forces of good. A dance of death as the dead rise out of their graves for the final judgment, separating the quick and the dead for all eternity. And then we get to the end of our book in the year 1493. In this manuscript inscription in the version I've been showing you, it ends with the phrase that comes from Jesus Christ in the New Testament, that I am the Alpha and the Omega, I am the beginning and the end, which notably is the description of an alphabet, of a form of writing, the letter alpha and the letter omega being the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. Now, writing takes us back into our subject of forgery, in this case of apocrypha and pseudepigrapha. So the time that remains, we're going to talk about what that means and then travel through a few of the apocryphal and pseudepigraphic texts that have been created or otherwise invented to augment the story of Christianity and the Judeo-Christian tradition, particularly in the period of late antiquity. So you'll recall that at the end of the Nuremberg Chronicle that I just showed you, there was the reference to the Alpha and the Omega. Jesus Christ is included with Moses along with the others inventors of alphabets. But here it's a doctrinal alphabet that is all about all time. The New Testament texts, the Gospels, were perhaps the most canonical of all for the purposes of the Christian tradition. But what in the Bible is truly canonical and what in the Bible is apocryphal? To figure that out, and one of the first people to do that was this man, Jerome, who is shown here as the inventor, among other things, of the Illyrican alphabet, the Illyrican language and alphabet, the letter forms. He was from the coast of Dalmatia, so this is modern-day Turkey. But he also looks at us with that rather skeptical eye that reminds us to caveat lector, as indeed he did more than anyone in the Judeo-Christian tradition and in sacred history. His work is so important. He's remembered in paintings and imagined portraits. We, of course, don't know what Jerome looked like, just many more than we know what Homer looked like. But here he is, represented in his paradoxical forms, sometimes as a quintessential monk in his cell, surrounded by books, and at other times as an ascetic living in a cave with strange props as his library furniture. In reality, he lived the last 3 decades of his life or so as an ascetic in the Holy Land after conducting a career in Rome, comparing the texts of the Bible. And indeed, he had access to those through a great library. This is a Vatican Library fresco imagining the Bibliotheca Caesiensis, which is the library that was available to St. Jerome in Palestine, where he spent the last part of his life. Here he is on the right with his ever-present lion attribute in that kind of semi-Aramitic form, holding in a toga, as it were, holding a codex and exploring the various texts of the Bible, canonical and otherwise. So in order to understand what is real, you have to have access to lots of different books. And that is what this image is telling us. And who has a great deal of books, indeed more books than anyone else in the world, when this painting was painted in the 1580s in the Vatican Library? But the Vatican itself. So St. Jerome, who died around the year 420 of the Christian era, provided, perhaps more importantly than anything, prefaces to each of the books of the Hebrew Bible, the so-called Hebraica Veritas. And he, in an important way, compared these with later Greek versions of the biblical text, including the Septuagint, which he did not assume was divinely inspired, as others had, including St. Augustine, and separated out those that were what he thought as apocryphal, particularly those that didn't exist in Hebrew linguistic form, in the Old Testament at least, and everything else. So if you read his preface to the books of Samuel and Kings, you'll see the so-called helmet preface, in which he separates the proto-canonical, the ultra-orthodox, as it were, texts of the Bible from the so-called deuterocanonical texts, trusting most importantly those that appeared for the Old Testament in Hebrew, thus covering a period of as much as 600 years of human history up to St. Jerome's own time. Now, we actually have the oldest complete Bible or semi-complete Bible that we have is the Codex Vaticanus, which speaks to the claims of authority of the Vatican Library. And here it is. It is likely the oldest nearly complete biblical text of the Greek New Testament from about the year 300. So this would have been 100 years old by the time of Jerome. It is one of four great uncial manuscripts, along with the Sinaiticus and the Alexandrinus and the Codex Ephremi, which are almost all basically in London and Paris now. But no two of these Septuagint texts are the same. Thus, the Vatican Codex keeps two books, the book of Maccabees 1 through 4, or excludes the books of Maccabees 1 through 4 altogether. But then the second oldest of these, the Sinaiticus, preserves them. It preserves number 1 and number 4. This is mostly at the British Library, this text, though portions of it are also preserved at Sinai at St. Catherine's Monastery, from whence it gets its name, a few segments at Leipzig and St. Petersburg. But it was not truly known to scholars fully until 1844. So unlike the Codex Vaticanus, slightly earlier probably, this includes a couple of texts that are often thought of as deuterocanonical, the Book of Maccabees. But like the Vatican, it omits a passage which appears in most other Bibles. So my point here being that even the earliest Bibles have lots of variation. And where there's lots of variation, there are opportunities to demonstrate moments of interpolation and indeed of outright invention. So the passage, the so-called pericope of the adulterer, the parable of the female adulteress before the judges, where Jesus says, "He who is without sin cast the first stone," doesn't appear in the Vaticanus, but does in the Sinaiticus. And it is notably the only passage in the Bible that actually has Jesus Christ writing something down. He's writing it in the sand, in the ground. Again, writing is a central theme of our course. So we have the proto-canonical texts of the Old Testament, which look pretty straightforward, the ones that most of us know. The Pentateuch of Moses, the historical books of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Kings, Chronicles, and so forth. The books of wisdom, Job, Psalms, Proverbs. The great prophetic texts of Isaiah and Ezekiel and Daniel. And then the many minor prophets from Hosea and Joel to Malachi. Then there are, a $10 word, deuterocanonical and apocryphal texts of the Old Testament. And here they are. Deuterocanonical include Tobit, Judith, where we get the famous theme of Judas killing Holofernes in lots of art. first three Maccabees, and so forth. And then the texts that are generally and almost, if not universally, considered apocryphal, Maccabees 4, and the prayer of Manasseh, and so forth. Now, the word apocrypha means secret or obscure, historical texts of an unknown authorship or some degree of doubtful origin, usually applied to biblical texts rather than secular ones, and especially those that appear in the ancient Greek Septuagint and Latin Vulgate Bibles that do not appear in Hebrew predecessors. So in the Roman Catholic tradition, there are the Deuterocanonical versus the Proto-canonical, as I said. The Deutero are secondary in their importance, that's what the Deutero means, and are accepted mainly as seminal expressions of Judeo-Christian tradition. There's a massive word that's almost unpronounceable of anagignoskomena, which means books that can be read profitably. Protestant Bibles call these deuterocanonical texts apocrypha for the most part and separate them, almost firewall them off from between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and list them as intertestamental witnesses. Pseudepigrapha are falsely attributed writings. That is to say, texts whose claimed author is not demonstrably the true author, or in some cases, misattributions of authorship to real authors in the past that don't exist as real authors of those texts. In biblical studies, this is almost always applied pseudepigrapha to falsely attributed Judeo-Christian religious texts, mostly from the 300 years before and after Christ. So these are Old Testament and New Testament pseudepigrapha. And their effect is largely to fill in the gaps, mine the gaps that I talked about earlier in the historical record. So they're often associated with religious sects, Hellenistic Jews who wish to apologize and promote the authority of Judaism in the post-Christian, the Christian world. Also Gnostics who were considered to be heretics by the proto-Christians. And the biggest theme here is that apocrypha and pseudepigrapha tend to humanize the divine. They increase the number and vitality and vividness, in a sense, of the stories of the canonical Bible by enhancing stories of the interaction between the divine and mankind. They create new dialogues, new gospels, in addition to the four canonical gospels of the New Testament. They offer more teachings of the apostles, in addition to the famous epistles of St. Paul. Lots more evangelical and martyrological acts by the apostles, and also expansionist prophecies and apocalypses as well. Now, as you can see, there are lots of Old Testament pseudepigrapha, way more than in the Bible itself. We have, for example, the letter of Aristeas, the Hebrew apocalypse of Enoch. Many of these survive in ancient manuscript forms. We have the Sibylline oracles, about which I'll talk about, and even the secret apocalypse of Moses, also referred to as the secret lives of Adam and Eve. The New Testament pseudepigrapha are even as numerous and go all the way up to the Middle Ages, including the false infant Gospels of Jesus in parts of the stories that are not told in the Gospels. The letter of Publius Lentulus, Jesus' letter from heaven, the epistles of Seneca with St. Paul, some of which I'll talk about, which gets us, last but not least, to the actual texts themselves. Here's a wonderful image of the Garden of Eden, and it looks fascinating until you realize what it really is the fall, the microscopic nature of ourselves after the fall, and by the reduction of original sin is vividly represented here. There's a great deal of imagery that's supplied to us, not from the in art, not from the canonical books of the text of the Bible, but actually from these apocrypha. So the Vita Adai et Evae, the continuation of the story of Adam and Eve, filling in the blanks that the book of Genesis doesn't provide. So Adam and Eve, they leave the garden and get really hungry after about 6 days of traveling, and they decide to do penance, hoping to return to the Garden of Eden. Adam resolves to spend 47 days standing in the River Jordan, Eve in the Tigris. Satan takes the form of an angel who persuades Eve to abandon her presence, a kind of reenactment of the original sin in the garden. Beset with grief, Eve wanders off and is about to give birth, and Adam finds her miraculously as his prayers are answered, and an angel comes to help with the delivery, and Cain is born. Here is a fanciful early modern image of Adam turning the soil with members of his family. All of this is anthropomorphized, this biblical texts. We have the very famous story of Cain and Abel. In the secret life of Adam and Eve, Eve has a nightmare of Cain drinking Abel's blood. So a prophetic dimension is added to the actual textual dimension. And then thus the murder of Abel and the expulsion of Seth to wander the world until the end of the world. And then some really dramatic funerary elements where Adam is dying and in pain, and he has to explain to his children who know no pain what pain is like, what illness is, and what death even is, and recounts the story of his and his wife's fall, Eve's fall, what death means in the world. Adam dies at the ripe old age of 930. The sun, the moon, and the stars are black for precisely 7 days, and then the funeral ensues. Eve follows in the same way and speaks to Seth, charging him to write the history of the life of his parents on tablets, not unlike the Ten Commandments. Another of these pseudepigrapha is the letter of Aristeas, which is actually the origin of the Greek Septuagint. It was a forgery of the 2nd century before Christ, and it recounts the story of how the emperor Ptolemy, the Egyptian Alexandrian king Ptolemy, who founded the Library of Alexandria, by the way, or promoted it extensively, ordered 72 of the most learned Jews to come to Alexandria to translate and to give them their Hebrew laws in Greek. And here I have the passages in the Nuremberg Chronicle to the left, including the 70 interpreters, sometimes it's 70, sometimes it's 72. And miraculously, they all write in separate rooms the golden letters of the translation. So it's a miracle that this is produced. And the king is so excited that he gives them all lots of money and sends them home on their way. Another of the most influential, and on the right I've got Michelangelo's versions of these figures on the Sistine Chapel ceiling at the Vatican. One of the most vital is the Sibylline oracles. Now these are ancient Roman oracular pagan texts, but they are taken up by the early Christians. They're actually written by Hellenistic Christians and Jews, but they're not pagan. But they're taken up by the early Christians as evidence of pagan prophecies of the coming of Jesus, so that even pagans had some whiff of the Christian revelation. And so the early Christian writer Lactantius cites the Erythraean Sibyl as predicting the coming of the Son of God. St. Augustine, in his City of God, notes how in a Greek manuscript of the prophecies of the Erythraean Sibyl and the Sibylline oracles, there's a certain passage where initial letters of the lines are so miraculously arranged that they actually spell out the fact that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and the Savior of mankind. And indeed, if you go through the text of the Erythraean Sibylline book, you will see the letters Jesus Christus Theo Vio Soter. This is, of course, plugged in by Hellenistic Judeo-Christian writers and then called pre-Christian in order to promote the idea that all religions are connected to one another through a single revelation that is ultimately Judeo-Christian. These Sibylline books, despite the fact that they were forgeries of the antique world, were nonetheless printed as if they were real, including facing page Greek and Latin translation, such as we have in our Bibliotheca Fictiva. In fact, it was not completely demolished until the early 17th century with this book by Opsueus on the right in the first decade of the 17th century. And then there are the New Testament pseudepigrapha, which are even in some ways more colorful. Thus, we learn about what Jesus looked like. As I'll get to in a moment. Here is the Infancy Gospel of Pseudo Matthew. So the Bible is quite silent on certain things that these apocryphal texts fill, such as, what did Christ do as he was a kid? Well, amongst other things, he soothed a dragon on the flight of the family, the Holy Family, to the Holy Land, as is represented in this medieval version of the text. He also plays with lions as a young boy, blessed as he is. It's a kind of reenactment of Daniel in the lion's den. And he even helps his dad out in the carpentry shop, showing his father, through his divine revelation, the most perfect ways of doing things with wood. We also learn what Jesus looked like through the so-called letter of Publius Lentulus, a fictitious letter written to the Senate of Rome by a non-existent prefect. This actually exists in hundreds of medieval manuscripts. It dates from about the 13th, 14th centuries. I show you two examples on the screen that have showed up in the antiquarian book market in the last 6 or so years. One of them, on the right, the image of Jesus accompanies that text. I wish I could get into a time machine, go back to that time when that was auctioned and added to the Bibliotheca Fictiva, but I have not been able to do that. I don't possess a time machine. I'm not a forger. And thus we have the description, the canonical description of Jesus. Here is a ephemeron of about the year 800, published in Dutch, of the very same pseudepigrapha. There appeared in these our days a man of great virtue called Jesus Christ, handsome with a reverend countenance. His hair is the color of chestnut brown. It is smooth, and is smooth almost down to his ears, but from then downwards his hair begins to curl, waving around his shoulders. His face is without wrinkles or spots. His beard is thick, the color of the hair of his head. His eyes are gray, clear, and quick. Unfortunately, it also says that he never laughs. And thus we get tens of thousands of portraits since the Middle Ages of Jesus, even Max von Sydow in The Greatest Story Ever Told in the 1960s, resembling this medieval forgery. The Bible says nothing about what Jesus looked like. We also get one better it was discovered miraculously in the year 1580 in a box within a box within a box, the original autographed manuscript of Pontius Pilate's death warrant condemning Jesus to death, inaugurating the salvific moment of mankind. We have one of only 2 copies of this great revelation illustrated on the title page of what is a pseudepigraphal text. We also have broadsides in the 18th century in English, representing multiple New Testament pseudepigrapha, from Jesus' letter to heaven, a 6th century forgery in which he changes the Sabbath from Saturday, the Jewish Saturday, to the Christian Sunday. King Abdar of Edessa's correspondence with Christ, which is a really early New Testament pseudepigrapha of about the 3rd century. And then Publius Lentulus, his 15th century or 14th century description of Jesus. All are smashed together in one ephemeral text to be circulated widely. And this letter from heaven is fascinating because it's a chain letter. He that hath a copy of this my own letter, written with my own hand, and spoken with my own mouth, and keep it without publishing it to others, shall not prosper. But he that publisheth it to others shall be blessed of me. Whosoever shall have a copy of this letter, and keep it in their houses, nothing shall hurt them, neither lightning, pestilence, nor thunder. The possession of this pseudepigraphical text is a kind of sovereign cure for all that ails you. It is apotropaic in its power to ward away evil. We even have manuscript versions of these medieval forgeries and pseudepigrapha in our library collection. I'll end with this magnificent object in front of you, which was just added to the Bibliotheca Fictiva a couple of months ago. It is stunning. It is a gigantic illuminated letter written by the Blessed Virgin Mary to the people of Sicily, particularly to the people of Messina, congratulating them on the early adoption of Christianity. The arms are of various figures of the Roman Catholic Church and of the Principality of Messina. There's the port, which enjoys the special protection of the Virgin, and slaves on the bottom and on the top, who represent individuals who live without the revelation of Christianity, being shown the letter on the upper portions, and thus enlightened. All of this, as it says at the bottom, Maria Virgo quae supra hoc cheirographum approvavit. That is to say, I, the Virgin Mary, approve this message. And that is what we mean by New Testament pseudepigrapha. And don't forget to remember what Jerome has taught us, to caveat lector. reader beware.